Good morning. Thanks for joining us for our devotional study on the book of Nehemiah. It's one of three historical books written about the Jews in exile in Babylon and their return. You'll remember that Jerusalem had been overrun by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC, and he completely destroyed their temple and razed the city walls to the ground. Now, a first wave of exiles had returned under a man called Zerubbabel, and he rebuilt the altar and completed the temple in 516 BC, 70 years after it had been destroyed, in fulfillment of the prophecy by the prophet Jeremiah. A second wave of exiles returned under Ezra 80 years later, and he, being a teacher of the law, began the moral reform of the nation. Now, the book of Nehemiah deals with a third wave of exiles under Nehemiah himself, and he returned to rebuild the city walls now 13 years later in 445 BC. He had been living in Babylon, and he was employed in the important position of the cupbearer to the king. And he received a report from his home country that the walls of the beloved city were still in ruins 58 years after the temple had been completed. Now let me explain the huge importance of city walls. Secure walls in a city means it can live at peace and safety without the fear of being invaded. At night the gates would be closed, and in the daytime visitors would be allowed in and commerce could take place. Once the walls were built, then homes and gardens could be built within the city. Jerusalem would once again be regarded as the capital of Israel and not look like some uncontrolled thoroughfare with a scattered population all living outside. So Nehemiah felt deeply about this, and the king Artaxerxes of Persia, whom he served, noticed that and allowed him to return to Jerusalem with letters guaranteeing his safety and also allowing him to use wood from the king's forests. And Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, had a look around, and then he gathered the people together and motivated and organized them to begin the reconstruction of the walls. He explained at the beginning that the disgrace it was to have broken walls in a city which was claimed to be of God and by God's people who had done nothing to restore it. It's a disgrace because they were dishonoring God. They claimed he was above all and was a God who would fulfill his promises, and here it was lying in ruins, and also it indicated their lack of commitment in terms of them being God's people and rebuilding it. Friends, the way you live and act and speak can either be something that is honoring to God, or it can be a disgrace. And you've got to ask yourself, is the way I'm living attracting people to Jesus, or is it distracting them and putting them off coming to real faith? The glory of God's name must always be utmost in our priorities. Now the people get encouraged to start rebuilding, and everyone gets involved, family by family, each building a section of the wall opposite their homes. No one's exempt. Everybody works, from the priests to the nobles, rich to poor. Everyone rolls up their sleeves. We told there were goldsmiths, perfume makers, and their daughters all working on the wall. And it's a lovely testimony then of how we can achieve great things when God's people work together. Unfortunately, history records there was a group called the nobles of Tekoa who would not put their shoulders to the work, and that's recorded for all time. But the rebuilding was not without its challenges. They had opposition from Sanballat. He was the governor of Samaria, and Tobiah, the governor of Transjordan. They arrived with their men and started pouring ridicule on the building project, and even they threatened the lives of the Jews. And as a result, the people got discouraged, and so Nehemiah had to take precautions now to guarantee their safety and protection. Let me read from Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 13 to 16. Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. So the people continued the work, but this time they were armed with a sword at their sides, and while some worked, others stood guard. Now the spiritual equivalent of that is that if we as believers are not able to be on the front line in terms of ministry, then at least we need to be at the back, supporting them with prayer, assistance, and whatever resources we can offer to help them be able to fulfill their mission. And guess what? This huge, extensive wall, which was just rubble to begin with, was completed in 52 days. And God is honored as a result. Nehemiah 6:16 says, when all the enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of God. So the story is essentially about a group of believers committed to a God-given vision who work together against great odds and with much prayer and complete the call of God in their lives. And God gets the glory. And the reason for Nehemiah's outstanding success is that he was a man of prayer. He prayed when he heard the distressing news of the broken walls. He prayed when he went to the king. He prayed every time he was ridiculed by his enemies. He kept praying throughout the whole project and beyond. He was a man who'd learnt to get on his knees when the need arose. And that is why God could use him. Friends, if you want growth in your own spiritual life and the growth in the life of your families and God's blessing on your business and your church, then you need to be men and women of prayer. And we also notice from Nehemiah outstanding faith. Faith that he had the call of God in his life. Faith when he's getting ridiculed and his people are getting discouraged, to encourage them with words like, our God will fight for us. And when you as a man or a woman act in faith, trusting God's complete strength in your life, then you become unstoppable. As long as you have locked into his perfect will and what his desires are for you, when you move forward in faith, you will be a blessing to others. Finally, Christian, there might be walls in your own life which are broken, areas of weakness, areas that have been neglected for a long time, areas that are not honoring to God. And it's time to rebuild those walls in your life, whatever they may be. You need to do it by prayer and by faith in God. And like Nehemiah, you can achieve great things for God. Don't be content with just being a thoroughfare for the world and the devil to go through at any time. It's time to get those walls up and then be able to be used by God. Come, let's pray. Father, help us as we seek to build the walls in our lives and become a blessing to others. Help us to be focused on your call and your vision for us, to be men and women of great prayer and great faith. We ask all these things in your precious name. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.